Welcome if you're new, and welcome back if you're returning. Today I have 5 upcycled thrift finds that I am going to be turning into vintage and French country inspired decor. The first item is a picture frame to a chalkboard. This is a picture frame that I had. I was going to donate it, but then realised that I did need a chalkboard at this property. At the last house it was a chalkboard wall. So what I did was I taped off the frame, and of course, because we've just moved, I can't find anything, so I had to use white tape, but I did use packing paper to make sure that it didn't run over. And then I gave it 3 coats of the chalkboard spray paint. The first coat went on quite well, and I noticed that you could still see the outline of the picture underneath, and I thought, okay, by the end of the 3rd coat this should be fine. However, you could still see it as in this picture, but the finished product is fine, no worries at all. Project number 2 is no sew toile curtains. It wasn't an intentional no sew. I couldn't find the pedal to my sewing machine, so I used glue instead, the hot glue. I had 2 panels that I previously picked up in a thrift haul, and they were too big for the windows, so I cut them both in half, so I ended up with 4 panels. I then took 2 white sheets, cut the white sheets the same size as my panels, and then glued them in like an envelope, so 2 sides and the top. I then turned it all inside out. These were the clips that I picked up from Amazon. Because of the way they're made, they are spray painted together and they're very difficult to open. So my tip is just to take a pair of pliers and give them that first quick open with the pliers, and that opens them up perfectly. And once they were turned inside out, as you can see, I put the clips across the top, and I'm very pleased with how they turned out. Project number 3 is a vintage china cabinet that I had in my basement at the last house. These are the moulds that I used. I used them with the paper clay. I've done this in one of my previous videos. I made 8 of these, left them to dry overnight, and then hot glued them to the cabinet, 4 on each panel. I then took the cabinet paint from my last kitchen, same colour, the navy blue, and painted it 2 coats all over. The glass piece I lined with a piece of very French country inspired fabric. It's the red and white stripe. It's like a linen material, and just stuck that inside the glass of the cabinet, and I'm very, very pleased with how that turned out, especially with the toile curtains. Project number 4 is a French inspired mirror. This was a mirror that I'd had at home. I've had it for about 20 years. I used the similar moulds with the same paper clay and made enough to go all around the mirror in at various points. I had some of it, left some of it wet as I made the moulds, and then positioned them on the frame so that they went while they were still pliable. I left them moulded against the frame so that once they were dry, they would stick on perfectly. If you wait too long, you won't be able to move these moulds because they dry like wood. So once all the pieces were dry, I left them overnight. I then took them in sections, marked out the halfway points all around the mirror, and then glued everything down with my glue gun, and I used the Gorilla Glue. It's a bit stringy, but it is by far the best glue for my glue gun that I've found so far. So I'd made it a little bit more ornate on the corners and at the top, and then left the bottom and the sides with a little bit less. Once they were all glued on, I then took my little pot of chalk paint and painted a first layer over the whole frame, including the little decals that I'd added. This is the chalk paint that I picked up, and I got this off Amazon. I also picked up these brushes from Amazon, but I don't think I would use them again because I found that they left bristles pretty well everywhere over the project. So I'm not going to use these brushes again. I'm going to try another one. So if you have any that you can recommend, if you've done it in the past, let me know, because like I said, I was not happy with the finish. With all the bristle hair all over it. One mistake that I did make, I wish I'd have painted the frame before I put the decals on. Because of the nature of these decals, they don't fit, not all of them fit directly flatly, so you could see the dark colour underneath. So what I did was I took a smaller brush and filled in all the little areas with a watered down version of the chalk paint. I then took another white chalk paint that I'd previously homemade and went a coat over that very sparingly, just to give it a little bit of depth. And then the last coat was the Varathane Poly Effects clear finish in metallic copper. And what this does, it gives it a really nice sheen, and it also fills in the areas. You can see it gives it a very nice antiqued look, a very worn look, that it's been worn over time, almost like a dirty finish. It sounds weird, but I know you know what I mean. This is what I covered it all with. I rubbed it off in a couple of spaces, and I also made it thicker in other spaces, and that was the last coat that I put on top to seal it. I didn't tape off the mirror, obviously because I couldn't find the painter's tape, but I did use a blade from my little X-Acto knife, and this works just as well. It's probably quicker because you're not taking all the time to mask everything off. If you prefer to do that and you know where your tape is, then you go ahead, but this wasn't too bad at all. This is the Poly Effects clear finished metallic that I used, and this is the finished project. Obviously it's not going to be sitting in my kitchen. It will be going in the living room when the living room has its makeover. Project number 5 is creating an Art Deco inspired clock. This clock I picked up a few weeks before we moved. It had already been painted white. I already had the decoupage on hand, and the paper was Art Deco inspired, Art Nouveau, and this was from Etsy. So it comes in one big sheet, and it was enough to cover the whole of the clock. So as you can see, I gave it a really good coat of the decoupage, and then tried to lay the paper so that as it went on the clock, it was centered to the face of the clock. I laid it down perpendicular to the front of the clock, so I had a little bit of a fold over at the front, and then I was going to cut it at the back the same width as the clock so that I had no waste. So as you can see, as I'm going, I'm taking the paper, I'm placing it on the clock, and then I'm pushing it down very gently with my fingers because it becomes very delicate once it's wet. It's a thicker, if you think of a really good quality tissue paper that you might use for wrapping, that's exactly what it is. So it's not awfully flimsy, but once it gets wet, it definitely becomes more fragile. So as you can see, I'm placing it on the clock and then just gently pressing it down into place with my fingers, and I'm being careful to get it in all the little creases and all the little folds as I go. When it came to the front, I cut off from the main panel that I'd made, and then placed the rest of it, like I said, centered to the face of the clock, and placed it on the front of the clock so that I get my pattern perfect. I laid it down, starting from the bottom. I glued the bottom first with the decoupage, laid it on central, and then placed it over the face of the clock, and then decoupaged it from there. Once you have the decoupage on and the papers placed on top of it, you do have a few minutes. This doesn't dry straight away. And then if you go over and trim it with a very sharp knife, but do be careful if it's wet because it is very fragile. And this is the completed project, and I must say this is probably one of my favourite flips of all time. It turned out so well, and it goes beautifully in the kitchen with the cabinets. Thanks so much for watching. Please let me know if you try any of these projects, and I'll see you next time.